Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Global trade remains under pressure after disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, where around 20% of the world's oil supply passes. A Paris meeting led by France and the UK is bringing together dozens of countries to plan how to secure the route after the conflict ends, focusing on mine clearing, ship escorts, and coordination while avoiding direct involvement in the war. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you so much, Benjamin.
Now, some of the latest developments see the Iranian foreign minister and as well as Trump announcing the reopening of Strait of Hormuz. Of course, this is relatively new, and the leaders of UK and friends are welcoming it with caution. But where do you see things going forward from here in terms of this newly formed coalition in Paris?
Well, first of all, before we get to that coalition, I think it's important to establish what has happened today in terms of this supposed opening of the Strait of Hormuz. We have had the Iranians say, okay, we're opening this to commercial shipping, not military, but they're doing so in a way which tightens their control of the strait. And how they do that, they say that you have to use predetermined routes. Those routes apparently go near the Iranian coastline and an Iranian island. It's a fairly narrow passage in the strait. And you have to notify and get permission from the Revolutionary Guards Navy, so from the Iranian military. Now, Donald Trump immediately came out and said, this is great, they fully reopened the Strait of Hormuz, either trying to spin what happened or not understanding this. But what has really happened is that Iran, as we're in the middle of these negotiations with the United States, and we may have a second set this weekend, is really, it's tightening its leverage on the strait, which is, look, you know, this was before the U.S.-Israel war, an open waterway anyone could go through. Now we're the ones who basically oversee it. What the UK and France and other countries have done today in Paris is they've made planning for how to escort and protect shipping through the strait after a ceasefire. In other words, I have to emphasize, this is not going to be an intervention while the war is going on. The question, however, is even if you get this ceasefire, is what will be the relationship between this coalition and the Iranians? Who will be charging ships to go through the straits? As you know, will it be the Iranians as they want to do? Will the international coalition say no? There's no reason for a charge. Who will provide the escorts for the shipping? Will it be the Iranian military? Will it be the international coalition? And an immediate question: who's going to get rid of the mines that are scattered throughout the strait? Some mines, we don't even know the location of them. So while the arrangements are probably welcomed, if you get a ceasefire, there's a long way to go before you can put this into practice.
All right, so like I mentioned, there's actually a lot of questions needed to be resolved or even figured out. Who's in charge of what, how to sweep the mines, and like you mentioned as well, France and the UK is saying that this is a post-war mission. So is this a real operational plan, or right now at this stage is mostly some sort of political signaling?
Well, it's both. I mean, it's political signaling to the Americans, to the Trump administration, who have demanded that other ships come in and help them, including with the blockade currently of Iranian ports. And other countries have said, with the exception of the UAE, no, we're not getting involved in this while there's a war going on. But I think there are operational plans going on because, again, you know, the Strait is one of the busiest waterways in the world. As you've mentioned, you know, it handles 20 to 25% of the maritime oil, maritime gas. It is extremely narrow at at one point being only about 32, 33 kilometers wide. So it's a fairly complex maritime operation, and you need to think who's going to contribute the ships, the vessels. How are the escorts going to be arranged? How are you going to deal with the backlog of tankers that has been bottled up in the Strait for 7 to 8 weeks? So, you know, this is not just politics. You have to lay the plans down. But I think my emphasis here is that what has changed is that you now have to deal with the Iranians. You know, the Iranians are going to want to have a say in the way that the way that shipping is protected, the way that it's overseen. I don't think you can just push them to the side.
All right. Yeah, like that's a very good question to be asked, how the Iranians might respond to a European-led naval presence after this conflict all blows over. So can we look at this as of whether or not Trump is telling the truth of the opening of the strait, whether or not these European ships will be allowed to pass and be relatively undeterred?
I mean, at this point, I wish the news media would just stop headlining what Donald Trump says, because quite often it doesn't connect with reality. Sometimes he doesn't understand what's actually happened, if you want to be honest. Sometimes he makes things up. And what you have to do is you have to go beyond Trump, as you're doing right now, to say, okay, wait a minute. What are the practical arrangements here? What are the political discussions that are going on? What are the arrangements regarding, regarding shipping, regarding the mines? What is the situation in terms of how close we are to getting an agreement, a lasting ceasefire? All these vital questions. And a lot of these questions are not easy to resolve. They're open at this point. So the idea, as Trump says, that the strait is completely open or that he'll have an agreement with Iran in 48 hours, that gets in the way of understanding this. Because I think I have to emphasize this. We are not going to go back to the situation before February 28th when this war started. That Iran is going to use the Strait of Hormuz as its leverage for the regime to survive. So it's going to want an agreement, not just for cooperation, but where they have a key role in this. The Europeans and other countries, don't forget the Gulf countries, on the other hand, are going to want a Strait of Hormuz, which is stable, which is not at risk of another escalation of violence, another war. And I think the interesting point of all of this is that even while Donald Trump tweets day after day, hour after hour about this, the United States is not necessarily at the center of these discussions. Yes, it has the military might there, but the fact here is that the United States burnt a lot of bridges. It burnt bridges with the Gulf states, who did not want this war. It, of course, has no effective relationship with Iran, and the Trump administration has insulted European countries. And I think you're going to see a realignment of discussions in which Washington is not at the center of whatever we wind up with on the other side of a ceasefire.
All right. While Trump was tweeting out, though, we do see market reacting in real time, and some already show that the oil prices are plummeting. Do you think that's probably a little bit of over optimism when it comes to being able to end this blockade?
I think the immediate response on the global oil prices dropping 10% was because of the Iranian announcement. To be honest with you, Trump comes in and piles in with a tweet, but I think, there was the prospect, because it was the Iranian foreign minister that announced this on social media, and everybody says, oh, okay, wait a minute, now we've got an arrangement to start to open up the strait, whereas the Iranians have maintained a chokehold on it. As the developments have moved through the day, you have seen question marks in terms of, right, how quickly would this arrangements for the strait be implemented? We've got questions about what the next U.S. Iran discussions are going to be. And so I think that immediate drop in the oil price down to around about $80 to $88 per barrel, I think oil's probably going to settle there and possibly ease a bit upwards. What has been interesting today, perhaps the most interesting comments, have been from the shipping companies. The international shipping organizations, the International Maritime Organization, saying, look, we welcome this news, but we need to see the steps be put in place. We're not going to have security until this is confirmed. And maybe even more interesting than that was the U.S. Navy. After Donald Trump put out that tweet, the Strait of Hormuz is completely open, advising ships not to go into the area because there are a lot of mines there and they don't know where some of the mines are.
All right, and also this all brings up the question if ceasefire does indeed take place, and well, you mentioned the term a lasting one, that one being very important here. If the Paris Coalition does go ahead, UK, France are patrolling or escorting ships, clearing mines. What happens if the ceasefire doesn't last, if conflict breaks out? Is the UK, is France ready to deal with any sort of aftermath?
They withdraw the ships. I mean, that's what's going to happen. I don't see any scenario in which the UK and France side with the US in terms of offensive operations against Iran. Now, if Iran was to fire on the French and British ships, or they were to fire on ships that were being escorted by them, then I do think you would see the French and British take action. So, in other words, I think we've got two scenarios here. One is, look, if the Iranians break the terms of the ceasefire, they threaten the Strait, then you have the European ships there that could be a protection force. If the Americans break the ceasefire, Europe is not going to want to be linked up with them in offensive operations. There are political repercussions if that happens, and it puts their warships in danger. So the line from Europe's been pretty consistent here. For all the trash talk that Donald Trump has done, the Europeans and indeed Asian countries, indeed other countries, the Gulf countries, have made it clear, look, if you want the Strait of Hormuz to truly be opened up, you have to stop the war. And that has put the Trump folks in a very difficult position because they both want to continue the war and they want the Strait to be opened. And they can't necessarily have both.
All right, so if the goal is to indeed reopen the Strait safely and quickly, what are some of the conditions that need to be in place for that to actually succeed?
Okay, I think you would have to have a short-term arrangement here where countries who are stakeholders in this, and again, I would look very carefully to the Gulf states. I would look to Greece, for example, which owns a lot of the tankers that move through this waterway. I would look to the Chinese as well, the Indians, the Pakistanis, so not just European countries. They are going to have to strike arrangements with the Iranians that are more than an ad hoc system at this point. You know that we get maybe 8, 10, 11 ships that have been passing through the Strait on a daily basis because the Iranians give them permission, usually for political or financial favors. You're going to have to see a consolidation of that arrangement. Now, how much are you going to give the Iranians? How much are they going to get for this? And then in the longer term, you really have this question, which is the Iranians have said it out there, and that is there will be a cost now for using the Strait of Hormuz. There will be a toll for using it. So what will that toll be? Will countries and individual owners be willing to pay that price to get their ships to continue to go through the waterway without risk of being blockaded or being held up?
All right, so we'll have to see how things shape out. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thanks to all your viewers.
Appreciate it. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.